So I'm going to start by sharing the aerial exhibit. This has been marked and shared previously. Um, so this is a site known as 60 Sunset Road, Township of Quantic. The property is a single corner lot. It's got a dual frontage on Sunset Road, and Room Ave. It's a pretty large site. It's approximately 173,000 square feet, more specifically 3.98 acres. So it's just a hair under 4 acres. When looking at some of the surrounding properties, it's notably larger than most of the residential properties to the back of us. Currently on the property, it's occupied by the Pompton Valley Presbyterian Church. This is a church that was constructed sometime in the 50s and 60s based on my review of the historic aerial imagery. But it's my understanding that the church has been closed for service within the last few years. So essentially no activity is currently taking place on the property. When looking at the site improvements, it consists of a parking area in the lower left-hand corner. To the immediate right, there are two church buildings, generally in the middle of the site. Moving up the site, there is a parsonage. Trouble with that one. Which was likely the home for the priest or minister. To the left of that is a small playground, and then to the right is what appears to be a pickup or drop-off zone with access on Room Ave. The site's overall condition looks to be what I would consider in generally average to poor condition. Much of the paved parking lot is cracked, it's faded, it's just generally showing signs of aging. There's some remnants of old parking stall striping on top of some newer striping. And it looks generally like it's just been patched over quite a few times over the years. Once again, it's my understanding that these buildings are not currently being used. Surrounding the property, as you can see, it's primarily single-family residences on smaller lots. Notable property is Quantic High School, which has been discussed directly across the street from the subject property. So this is a fairly typical land use pattern for a single family zoning district that we're in. We're in the R15 1/3 acre residential zoning district. You generally have these types of uses. You have schools, you have churches, and you have single family residential dwellings. So pretty standard, 1/3 acre residential zoning district. So I'm shifting to our site plan rendering to talk about the proposed use. So just for the record, this is the colorized rendering that matches the submitted site plans. So all existing structures on the property are going to be demolished along with the asphalt pavement, and the applicant proposes the construction of a private school serving grades 3 through 12. It's a 27,825 square foot, 2-story building with the primary frontage facing Sunset Road. Vehicular access is going to be removed along Room Ave where that pickup drop-off was, and it's going to be concentrated on Sunset Road. Towards the left of the building will be the parking spaces, the parking area for faculty and the few students that wish to drive. The front of the site is going to contain the drop-off area for the vans. Between the drop-off area and Sunset Road is some stormwater management improvements, a basin. And then to the back of the building is going to be the areas for recreational activities for the students, the soccer court, some of these hardscape courts, and other activities that they're going to be doing when not in the classroom. Just to talk a little bit about the landscaping, Mr. DeVito, our landscape architect, testified. There's a substantial amount of trees and landscaping proposed, particularly on 3 sides of the perimeter of the site, the areas that are abutting the residences to the rear and the left side, and then to Room Ave to the right side. There's also proposed sidewalks around the property, as well as other standard improvements that you find with any land development project, like curbing, crosswalks, lighting, proper utility connections, etc. So really focusing on the proposed use here of a private school. So in New Jersey land use planning, a school is classified as what we call an inherently beneficial use. This is laid out in the municipal land use law. Essentially, the municipal land use law, or the MLUL, that is our state's enabling legislation, what gives municipalities the power to zone and write and approve zoning ordinances, AKA it's the state's zoning rule book. And in the definition section, they define inherently beneficial uses. And they state that this is a use which is universally considered of value to the community because it fundamentally serves the public good and promotes the general welfare. In that definition, they go and they name some inherently beneficial uses. That such uses include, but are not limited to, a hospital, a school, a childcare center, group home, wind, solar, or photovoltaic energy facilities or structures. So schools are explicitly mentioned in the municipal land use law as an inherently beneficial uses. So essentially, these are a class of uses that are considered so beneficial to society, they deem to automatically serve the general welfare of the society because they're uses that are essential to keep us progressing forward. So I think it's important to note, while an inherently beneficial use, it might not directly benefit an individual or even a community per se, but that doesn't diminish the status of that use itself. And we see this a lot in land use planning. You have religious uses, and you might not be of that religion. You have schools, but you might not have school-age children. Even radio and cell and communication towers are considered inherently beneficial uses, but they could be for a company that doesn't directly serve you. So this is a group, this is a class of uses that serve the public at large, that serve society at large. I know that some members of the public may disagree about the benefits of the use itself, but I just wanted to bring up how the state defines these uses. Whether public or private, schools are considered inherently beneficial uses. So as it pertains why we are in front of the zoning board tonight, we're here seeking a D3 conditional use variance. This is different than a straight D1 use variance, where in that case, a use would be prohibited. This use is conditionally permitted in the R15 zoning district. So the R15 zoning district, it's a single family zoning district. It permits principally single family dwellings and open space and recreation areas. Conditionally, it has a larger list of uses that it permits, and schools obviously are on that list. Just to name a couple other uses that are on that list, you have churches, you have religious uses, you have community centers, you have hospitals, nursing homes, and even medical offices. So it's a fairly comprehensive list of uses that are conditionally permitted in this R15 zoning district. So back to our conditional use as a school. What the zoning ordinance does was it overlays or attaches a certain set of conditions for this use if it's going to exist in this R15 zone. Specifically, we have 7 conditions for a school. Really, they're just a revised list of bulk requirements for the school. And I think that the intention of that is because single family bulk requirements, things like setbacks and coverage requirements, would generally be inappropriate to apply to a school given its different scale, different size property, different nature of those operations. So the governing body has essentially considered this conditional use with these 7 conditions. Now, these conditions, they relate to lot size, minimum frontage, lot width, maximum height, maximum side yards, maximum rear yards, and a minimum buffer requirement. So out of all those 7 conditions, we meet all of them except minimum lot area. That's actually the one that we don't have control over. 5 acres is required and 3.98 acres exists and is proposed, so just a hair under 4 acres. So that's really the trigger of this D3 conditional use variance, is the size of the property. And once again, that is the one that the applicant doesn't have reasonable control over, and that I'll get more into some of the justifications on that. So how we deal with conditional use variances in New Jersey, the legal basis for conditional use variances, as I mentioned, it's different than the straight D1, which you would apply the Medici standard. That doesn't apply in this case. In this case, you apply the Coventry standard. And what the Coventry standard established was that the board's focus for this D variance is not on the use itself, because the use is conditionally permitted. The governing body finds this to be a compatible use. So the board's focus shifts from the use to the deviation that we do not comply with, which is lot size. So going through the proofs to support the justification of the grant of the variance for lot size. As I mentioned, this is not a self-created condition. 5 acres exists, 5 acres is required, 3.9 acres exists and is proposed. It's obvious that we're surrounded by other residential properties. The applicant wouldn't able to make any reasonable, realistic acquisition of land in order to make this comply. It's obviously a much larger property than all the surrounding properties. It is zoned for a variety of conditional uses. You wouldn't want to put a moratorium of development on it just because it will never meet that conditional use standard. Secondly, I like to look at the intensity of the development that is proposed. So the ordinance conditionally permits private schools and public schools. Public schools are typically larger than private schools because generally when they're constructed, it's because a town is experiencing some sort of growth. They might have other large development projects in the pipeline, which typically generate more school-age children coming into the town. And essentially, when a town needs to accommodate that sort of growth to be able to provide everybody public schooling services, they're forced to build a new school. Private schools operate a bit differently. They are concerned with their own growth and their own operations, but they do have the liberty to control the scale and the size of what they're building given the lot size. And I think that's important because I think what we have here is a development that was scaled proportionately given the nearly 4-acre site that was essentially given to the client. So I actually think this is a good opportunity specifically for a private school to exist on the site because they're not forced to accommodate some sort of necessary growth that a public school would typically experience. Furthermore, with regards to the deficient lot size, Mr. Modesto, our civil engineer, had testified that although the lot is undersized per the conditional use requirements, the lot is still suitable for this development to protect it from flooding and stormwater runoff. Mr. Korak and Mr. Markham testified that although we do have this parking variance, we are still proposing more parking than we need on a regular basis, which I believe was a parking demand of 23 spaces, and we have 44 on site. So the overall point I think I'm trying to make here is that when you have a lot size and you have a lot size that's undersized per the ordinance and the condition, what you do is you generally start to scale back the amount of parking we have. You move that building further away from the residences. You work with the constraints of the property itself. And I think with regards to traffic, with regards to the parking testimony, with regards to stormwater, there wouldn't be substantial impacts with regards to those aspects of the site, and that this site can still accommodate the use of a private school. Now, I just want to briefly go into each of these conditions themselves and see how we stack up. So I talked about the lot size deficiency. So that was essentially condition 1. There's 6 more conditions that we do comply with, and we actually over comply with. The minimum frontage on the road must be 50 feet in width. We're 456.3 feet, so we're more than 9 times compliant with that one. The minimum lot width must be 300 feet. We are 456.3 feet, so we're 1.5 times compliant with lot width. The maximum height permitted is 35 feet and 2 stories. We're only 29 feet and 3 5/8 inches to the top of the roof. That's only about 84% of the maximum height that you can go up. So we could essentially go up another 5 feet and still be permitted with regards to the height. I think it's important to note too, the majority of the building is actually under 20 feet. So once again, max height is 35 or 20 in most areas, 29 at the highest point. With regards to the side and rear yard setbacks, the side yard requirement is 50 feet. And on this left side, we are 105.3 feet. So we're more than double compliant on the side yard. The rear yard requirement is 50 feet. We are 154.2 feet. So we're more than 3 times compliant. And with regards to the required buffer, 25 feet is required. We are 29.9 feet proposed. So this is almost 10% more buffering than the zoning requires. But that's just at its closest point, is that 29 feet. It actually gets a lot bigger in most areas, 30 or 40 feet. Once again, that 25 feet is required. So going back to supporting the proofs for the D3 conditional use variance of not having the appropriate lot size, what you do to mitigate having a smaller lot is you generally try and over comply with other requirements. And what the applicant proposes here is taking the building, and even though the setbacks for the rear and side are 50 feet, pulling that building away from the residences, putting more buffering than we need, putting more trees than we need, and just generally trying to mitigate every potential issue that would arise of not having the required lot size. So that leads into the next part of my discussion, which we call the negative criteria of the variances. This is the kind of the analysis on the potential impacts of that deviation from that conditional use requirement. There's 2 parts to it, first prong and second prong. Now that first prong, we talk about the substantial detriment to the public good. So the focus is on the effect of the surrounding properties of the grant of the deviation. And I think I already kind of got into that, is that we attempted to over comply in other areas despite not having all this land that's required. With regards to, and I'll just briefly touch on a couple different topics regarding the impact. We talked about stormwater management. Mr. Modesto, our civil engineer, had testified that the site currently has poor drainage and is now being improved with new stormwater management facilities. Specifically, he mentioned that it's being brought up to code with regards to NJDEP requirements. And his conclusion was that he designed the site to be safe from flooding and stormwater management, and that it's going to improve the current condition with regards to stormwater runoff. We've talked a lot about traffic and parking already. Mr. Korak had testified that the ingress and the egress to the site is safe and efficient, and that the project can accommodate the proposed needed parking, which is based on the operational testimony of One School Global. With regards to aesthetics and landscape buffering, Mr. DeVito, our landscape architecture, who prepared our landscaping plan, which I think is nothing short of impressive. It's certainly the most landscaping I think I've seen on a site plan, especially for a school. Proposed that there will be substantial buffering and landscaping surrounding the site. With regards to the building itself and the scale and the impacts of the size of the building, I think I already hit on this. The goal was to move this as far away from the residences as possible, to over comply with those setbacks, to be under the height. And I think that's what we did here. So once again, smaller lot, but I think the applicant has made a very reasonable and impressive effort in trying to mitigate these concerns that you would normally associate with a deficient lot area. Now, moving on to the second piece of that impact standpoint, it is the applicant's burden to demonstrate that this doesn't go against what the zoning ordinance intends and what the master plan intends. So in all land use applications, I take a read of the master plan, I read through the goals and the objectives, and confirm that the development isn't contradicting anything that is laid out in the master plan. I can say that this development is not contradicting any of the goals or objectives of the 2019 master plan. I'd like to just bring up a couple of comments in the master plan as it relates to our application. The land use goals on page 14 of that master plan, one of the goals is to right-size parking ratios to reflect current and future trends. So this is representative of parking requirements that are usually laid out as a one-size-fits-all approach, but not everybody typically operates in the same parking demand as the zoning ordinance. And I think that's what we've testified to. We have been able to quantify the number of people bringing cars to this property, and what our engineers have designed was a parking plan that fits the needs of this operator and applicant. So I found that interesting that that was in the master plan. That has been something that a lot of planners have been looking at in recent times, is to try to move away from this one-size-fits-all parking requirement and trying to essentially right-size it for each applicant. Another thing that was interesting was to ensure non-residential land uses are compatible with surrounding neighborhoods and require buffers to mitigate impacts. Once again, they've done it. They've have the buffering. They have the overcompliance with the setbacks. We are sensitive to the fact that residents do exist proximate to the site, and I think that the applicant has made a reasonable effort in overcompliance with those aspects. A utilities element goal on page 16 talks about ensuring new development properly captures all potential stormwater runoff. As Mr. Modesto, our civil engineer, testified, that a whole new stormwater management system is being proposed on the site, and we are improving it in its current condition. So stormwater improvements are based on his testimony, will improve with this development. And then, as I mentioned, there was nothing else in those goals or objectives that I think go against what the applicant is proposing on this site. Now, lastly, how this stacks up against the zoning ordinance, specifically the R15 zone. So this is a zone that, as I mentioned, conditionally permits schools, whether public or private. Therefore, by the nature of the ordinance, is presumed that the governing body has found this type of use to be compatible in a district with single-family residential uses. So this is, once again, this is not a request for a use that is not allowed to enter this zone. This is conditionally permitted. We're dealing with a deviation from one condition, which is really the reason why we're in front of the zoning board, and it's something that we don't have control over. So there's nothing that has been proposed in this application that goes against the intent of what the R15 zone is essentially trying to govern. So that sums up the D3 variance. Now I'd like to go into the C variances that we're seeking. So first and foremost, we are seeking a C variance for the maximum impervious coverage. 35% is permitted and 39% is proposed. It's only 4% over that. It's not a substantial intrusion into the non-permitted coverage area. Really, the two main purposes for regulating coverage are for aesthetic reasons, having too much hardscape surfaces on a property, and then for stormwater management and runoff purposes. So I'd like to kind of unpack that into two parts. So from a visual standpoint, as I mentioned, we have a substantial amount of landscaping and greenery and buffering on the site. It gives the appearance of a very green site when you're reconciling that with impervious coverage. It doesn't appear like a non-compliant impervious site because it is very green. So aesthetically, I think we've made the intent is there. Now, once again, with regards to the stormwater improvements, Mr. Modesto had testified that stormwater management will be improved with this development. So those are kind of the two parts that I think generally regulate the impervious coverage that I think have been mitigated with this proposal. With regards to parking and the required number of parking spaces, the zoning ordinance requires 56 parking stalls. We have 44 spaces that are proposed. As you've already heard the testimony of both Mr. Markham and Mr. Korak, the operations of the school, they don't anticipate requiring as much parking as what the zoning ordinance requires. Mr. Korak wrote the traffic and parking studied. Once again, they were able to quantify the number of students that would drive, the number of employees on the site, and work out a number that would work for them. I think once again, we kick this back to the master plan that says right size parking requirements for specific uses kind of on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's exactly what we've done here. We're not building too much parking to the point where you don't need it, and you're creating more hard surfaces, which would contribute to that impervious coverage variance. With regards to the maximum number of permanent signs, we need variance relief for that. The ordinance says that no more than one permanent sign is permitted on any residentially used lot. We're seeking that variance. I'm not sure that even applies to us because it says a residentially used lot. But I think that goes into the justification. So we have 4 signs that are proposed, and once again, 1 is permitted. I think that intent seemed to apply to residentially used lots and not schools. Having a single sign for a school would probably be inappropriate given the fact that they typically have multiple signs on a property. You usually have a freestanding sign or a monument sign, and then you usually have a couple wall signs that are on the building that typically display the name of the school. So we are seeking that variance for going over the maximum number of signs. But once again, I think that is inappropriately applied to schools. I think the ordinance intended that clearly for residentially used lots. We are seeking, staying on signage, we're seeking a requirement, a variance for the maximum sign area. 2 square feet is permitted for home occupation, and then 12 square feet is permitted for professional use. Once again, these sign requirements that have been applied to the site, they're under the section of signs in residential districts. And I'm led to believe that they don't apply to schools, which is the reason why we exceed those maximum square footages. But we do have 2 attached signs on the front of the building. We have a 40 square foot sign and an 18 square foot sign. The 40 square foot sign is the sign displayed on the outside of the gymnasium. It's very typical, once again, to have usually displaying the school's names or the school's name outside of the gymnasium, kind of higher up, as we have in this application. And then we have an 18 square foot sign at the main entrance, basically displaying the school's name right next to the doorway. Very typical of a school or any building, because it signifies where to enter the building and where the main entrance of the school is. With regards to the freestanding sign height, the maximum height for a professional use is 4 feet, and then for any other use is 3 feet. And we have 6.5 feet in height. Those are the 2 signs that sit near the entrance of the property where the vans will be entering. And then there's a second one near the parking area to the left. These are typical one school global prototypical signs. They are wayfinding signs to identify the different areas of the property or the building. It's really a directory style sign displaying the directions and the locations of the different features on site. Things like main entrance to the right, parking area over here, recreation fields to the back. These signs, they are standard. You do see freestanding signs in front of schools that do exceed what the ordinance permits, which is 3 feet. It's not uncommon to have a sign of this size and these locations on this type of property. But in order to mitigate that potential height impact of the variance, what we did was we complied with the freestanding sign setback requirements. Only 10 feet is required for that sign from this side yard to the left, and it's about 85 feet from that sign. So it's pulled, a little bit higher, but once again, pulled away from the residences. The one in the front, also only 10 feet is required, and it's 25 feet back. So once again, a little higher, but pushed into the site more to help further mitigate any of those potential, small height increases. Now there's a section of ordinance that talks about signs permitted for institutional uses. This is finally where I think these really apply to us now. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I appreciate that clarification. And I agree with the interpretation of it. these variances were on the plans. So I just wanted to make sure that we put it on the record just in case. Yeah, but I agree, and I thank you. So moving forward, so those requirements, the signs for those institutional uses, what's permitted is you get 3 signs: freestanding sign, 1 changeable letter sign, and 1 attached sign. So 3 total. And what we have is 4 total. We have 2 freestanding signs that I spoke about in the drive aisle and the parking area. And then we have the 2 attached wall signs, 1 on the gym and 1 near the entrance. As I mentioned, the justification for some of these, it's prototypical of One School Global to have these wayfinding signs. They want to make sure that they direct, vans, children entering the site, where to go, where to enter. It's customary that you have a sign near an entrance. It's also customary that you display the name of the school on the gymnasium, and that's what we essentially see here. So while 3 are permitted for institutional uses, which do include schools, we exceed that by 1. But this isn't, once again, this is something that I think relates to the One School Global safety and operations of the site, and is not majorly uncharacteristic with a school development. On signage still, we're seeking a variance for the attached sign height. What's required is that no sign shall be installed so that the top of the edge is higher than 14 feet measured from the ground. What we have proposed here is 16 feet. Now, this is not a 16-foot tall sign. It's just that the top of the sign is 16 feet from the ground. That's the sign that is on the outside of the gymnasium. As Mr. Ralph had mentioned, that is a direct result of the architecture of the building. The first story essentially has an overhang which hangs over the walkway that covers that sidewalk to the entrance that go to the entrances to the property. So the sign really can only be above it or below it. If you put it below the overhang, you have trouble with visibility and being able to actually see it. So the more appropriate location would be above that overhang. Once again, really just a function of the architecture of the building, but not a result of the building being too high or anything like that, because as I mentioned, we are compliant with that height. Moving on to fencing, the maximum fence height in the established front yard, that would be Sunset Road. You're permitted 3 feet, and it must be set back 5 feet and 50% open. We do comply with the setback requirements. We do comply with the openness requirements. Now, what's proposed is a 5-foot in height fence. As you've heard some of the operational testimony, this proposed fence height is specifically for security and safety of the students, and it was designed based on these One School Global security standards. This is a height that they have at other locations. It's a height that they're proposing here, and they feel comfortable with to continue to operate and provide a safe and secure learning environment for their students. Additionally, I believe Mr. Modesto testified to the function of the 5-foot fence in the front, given the fact that there is a basin adjacent to that fence. And, it would be more appropriate to prevent potentially people from, in the unfortunate circumstance, falling into that basin, that a 5-foot fence would protect against that better than what's required by the ordinance, which is the 3-foot fence. And then lastly, with regards to fencing, we're also seeking a variance. It's essentially a similar variance for the fence height in the secondary front yard, which is the fence that runs along Room Ave. That one, you are allowed to go up 4 feet. And once again, we're still 5 feet there. Same justifications as the previous variance. The same height of this fence is maintained throughout those frontages. It's essentially born out of a desire for not only continuity with the design of the fence, but also that safety aspect of the school's operations. So moving on to the negative criteria, that sums up the C variance relief that we're seeking. Once again, we like to look at what the impacts are of these C variances, specifically that the variance approval can be granted without substantial detriment to the public good, and that there will be no substantial detriment to the zoning ordinance or the master plan. When we look at the proposal on its, in its entirety, we like to look at all different aspects of land development here with regard to the impacts. Traffic and parking has been discussed. Mr. Korak had provided multiple traffic and parking analyses, and his conclusions were that there would be no significant impacts to the adjacent roadway network, and that the parking supply on the site as it's proposed would support the demand required by One School Global. With regards to noise, building was placed as far as it can be from the residences while still allowing the room for the drop-off operations in the front. This is a conditionally permitted use, once again, which means that the governing body has found this to be compatible with surrounding residential properties. Any noise generated is to be of similar nature of any other conditionally permitted or principally permitted use in this neighborhood. It was mentioned that the property will comply with all inappropriate applicable noise ordinances as they apply to this site. With regards to lighting, a lighting plan was submitted. There's no anticipated substantial lighting impacts on any of the surrounding properties. There's no spillover of lighting. There's substantial amount of buffering surrounding this property. All lighting conforms to the foot candle requirements of the zoning ordinance. With regards to stormwater, once again, Mr. Modesto testified that the stormwater management will be improved on the site and is safe from flooding. And then lastly, with regards to height and building scale, as I mentioned, the building height requirement is compliant with the maximum permitted height for the zone. It's actually lower than how high we could go up. With regards to setbacks, building coverage, height, these are functions of where you place a building and how big you go. With regards to setbacks, building coverage, and height, we're compliant with all of them. And this building, I think, is proportionate to the One School Global operations and with the lot size that was given to us. Now to that second piece, that second prong of the negative criteria of no substantial impairment to the intent and purposes of the zone plan and zoning ordinance. As I mentioned before, in my testimony regarding the D3 conditional use variance, I went through those master plan goals and how we align with some of them. And then once again, I will reiterate for the record that the C variances do not go against substantially any of those goals laid out in the master plan. And then with regards to the zoning ordinance, same testimony as with the D3 conditional use variance. Once again, this is conditionally permitted, compatible use in this zone. These C variances, what we've done is trying to over comply with some of these requirements. So I don't think that even with regards to the C variances, they substantially go against the purposes of what the R15 zoning district requirements are attempting to regulate. So to sum up, I believe that after a complete review of this application, the D3 planning proofs support the grant of the conditional use variance. I think that this site can accommodate the proposed use despite not meeting that single condition of the minimum lot size. Once again, this is not a condition that the applicant has any control over. Therefore, planning wise, it shouldn't present any realistic opportunity to redevelop this site or limit any development on this site indefinitely. I think that the testimony presented supports the fact that this site was scaled back to the user's needs, and it was designed to operate safely and efficiently and appropriately, which essentially satisfies the concerns of not having that full 5-acre lot size. With regards to the C2 variances, these are the bulk requirements for parking, for signage, and for fencing. I think they can be granted under what we call the benefits versus detriments criteria of the municipal land use law, also called the C2 criteria. Basically, you weigh the benefits of the project as a whole against the potential detriments. And I think that the benefits of the project as a whole, eliminating a vacancy, proposing an inherently beneficial use, mitigating stormwater impacts, over pulling the building farther away from the residents. I think those all go into the benefits bucket. And I do think that they substantially outweigh the potential detriments of those C variances, of those minor variances regarding to fencing and signage. So with regards to the municipal land use law, I think that the project aligns with many of the fundamental purposes of the MLUL, specifically Purpose A, which states to encourage municipal action to guide the appropriate use or development of all lands in the state in a manner which promotes public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. That purpose is automatically fulfilled by the fact that we are an inherently beneficial use. Purpose B is to secure safety from fire, flood, panic, and other natural and man-made disasters. Once again, Mr. Modesto had mentioned how the site has been designed to be safe from flooding and is an improvement to the existing stormwater management system. Purpose C is to provide adequate light, air, and open space. The applicant proposes a large open space in the rear, and we have strategically placed the building away from those residential dwellings purposely to leave a gap or as much gap as possible and over compliance with those setback requirements. So we have that nice gap to those residential uses. Purpose G is to provide sufficient space and appropriate locations for a variety of uses. Schools fall into one of those variety of uses where obviously there's a need to serve it in the state of New Jersey. That's why it's listed as an inherently beneficial use. So appropriate location for the use, you have the biggest available lot in the R15 zone that is zoned for schools. It's a vacant property now. It's a corner lot. It has access to Sunset Road. I think it's been presented on why this is an appropriate location for a school. Purpose I is promote a desirable visual environment through creative development techniques and good civic design and arrangement. So we focus on that. I want to focus on that aesthetic piece here, desirable visual environment. I think that visually this development represents an improvement to the visual aesthetics of the site. We have all this new landscaping, all this new greenery. You have a new development on this currently vacant and under-maintained, frankly, corner lot. You have new sidewalks, new crosswalks, new curbing, street trees. All those things go into how people perceive the visual environment and the aesthetics that go around the neighborhood. And I think we are improving them substantially with this application. To sum up, land use planning and zoning, it's about balance, as I mentioned with my justifications for the C variance. You balance the zoning benefits against the zoning harm, the good versus the bad, pros versus cons. It's a very typical decision-making factor that we use, not just in land use planning, but in some everyday decision-making. And I think that this being an inherently beneficial use, the applicant doing everything possible and reasonable to comply with these conditions, with these requirements, to over comply with certain requirements, to agree to certain conditions that have been discussed. I think that what we see here is that the benefits do substantially outweigh the detriments when we're looking at this proposal as a whole. Really, the C variances are essentially some fencing and signage variances. The parking variance we discussed, but it's really all, for the most part, pretty minor variances that we're seeking here. They're more, the signage and the fence related are more design related items than items that would relate to a building size or intensity or massing or anything of that nature. We comply with all of those requirements, which I think is very important because those are the requirements that generally guide how large a development is going to be. So overall, I think what you have here is, once again, it's a property that was given a almost 4-acre lot size. We had to work within the constraints of that lot size. So things have been scaled back, looked at, quantified, and mitigated. And I think what we have here is a sound design. And I think that the D3 conditional use variance can be granted because of that. And I think that the positives of this application as a whole substantially outweigh the detriments. Thank you.
Mr. Ricci, I have a few questions. As part of your testimony, did you have an opportunity to look at other properties in the R15 zone relative to their size?
I did.
And what were your findings regarding the size of the properties that are available in the R15 zone for such a development as this?
I mean, the sizes vary based on what type of school it is. Obviously, the high school being directly across the street is a much larger property. It was 31 acres. I also looked at the Stephen Gerace Elementary School. That was about 14 acres.
Right. So let me ask the question this way. Was there any other available site in the R15 zone that was larger than this one?
No, this was the largest available property in the R15 zone that conditionally permits schools.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have at the moment.